Hi there, I'm Jim Zirin. Welcome back for more conversations. With us is an old friend, Chris Whipple, author, documentary filmmaker, TV producer, and man for all seasons. Chris is the author of The Fight of His Life, 2023, about Joe Biden, The Spy Masters, 2020, about directors of the CIA, and The Gatekeepers, 2017, about White House chiefs of staff. All well-sourced accounts of the inner workings of government. This year, he has come out with a terrific new book entitled Uncharted-How Trump Beat Biden and the Odds in the Wildest Campaign in History. The book's a runaway bestseller. Last I looked, it was number 6 on the New York Times bestseller list and near the top of the heap in all Amazon rankings. Many books lose their relevancy as time goes on. This book seems to become more relevant every day of the chaotic Trump administration. In the book, Chris draws some startling conclusions on why Biden waited so long to step down, what mistakes Kamala Harris and her campaign made in a candidacy that seemed doomed from the get-go, why Trump won, and where it all seems to be going. We're pleased to welcome Chris Whipple back to the program.
Great to be back, Jim.
Well, congratulations on your book. I thought we might start with your title, Uncharted. What was uncharted about the 2024 election?
Well, it was the wildest election in history, as we all know, having lived through it. But behind closed doors, it was wilder and stranger yet. And I felt that I was uniquely qualified to write it, not because I'm smarter than anybody else, but because I had sources at the highest levels of the Biden campaign and the Trump campaign, and I'd like my chances of getting into the Harris campaign, and I did. So it was a wild campaign, and frankly, it was a wild publishing venture too. I mean, Kamala had 107 days, so did I, to get it done and send it in.
Well, you got it done, and she didn't.
Yeah.
So there seems to be a spate of books now about the 2024 election. I mean, Jake Tapper has a book, Original Sin. Michael Wolff's All or Nothing. There's some other books. Why this tremendous interest?
Well, I think I was writing another book entirely in the summer of 2024 when Joe Biden dropped out of the race and the bottom fell out of the political world as we know it. And I picked up the phone. All I can do is speak for myself, but I picked up the phone and called Lisa Sharkey, the force of nature at HarperCollins, my boss, and I said, this is the political story of the century. And I think I should put this other book aside. I was writing one on the history of presidential campaign managers from 1968 to the present. So you can imagine that was pretty useful background. We went off to the races, and obviously a number of other authors did too.
Well, everyone who's done an anatomy of the 2024 election argues that Biden should have dropped out sooner. LBJ dropped out in January of the election year, and his vice president, Hubert Humphrey, was able to run and damn near defeated Richard Nixon. Suppose Biden had dropped out in January. Do you think it would have made a difference?
So we'll never know the answer to that question, Jim, but obviously it's a huge question for history. And Hubert Humphrey, as you point out, back in 1968 was able to break with LBJ on his conduct of the Vietnam War very late in that campaign. It was end of October. And he got a real surge, almost caught Nixon in a photo finish. Kamala Harris was unable to do that, obviously. The question really is, had Biden dropped out a year earlier, 2 years earlier, had he been the so-called bridge that at one point he promised to be to the next generation, would the Democrats have emerged with a stronger nominee? I think chances are they would have. There's always the possibility that that's just more time for a Democratic nominee to make mistakes. So you never know. Sometimes they tack to the left. But I think, along with Leon Panetta, one of my favorite sources and advisors, Panetta said, look, you can't, the only real chance they had was to have had a real primary with enough time for a candidate, a stronger candidate to emerge.
But we really don't know because would Biden have endorsed Kamala Harris in the primary? Presumably he would have.
Yeah.
Presumably she would have won anyway.
Well, but would she have
nomination.
emerged, rather than having a 107-day runway to take on Donald Trump? The question becomes: would she have had a much better chance? Would she have been strengthened as the nominee? And I think, look, I think Democrats are angry, and rightly so, about Joe Biden's 11th hour abdication from the ticket, leaving Kamala Harris with, in effect, mission impossible. Such a short runway to take on Donald Trump, and of course, it proved to be mission impossible.
But she was so strong out of the box, Chris. She had a terrific convention. Fundraising was memorable. She outraised Trump 3-1, I think. And she absolutely destroyed Trump in the debate, I thought, anyway. The only point he made was you had 4 years to do it, and you didn't do it. I don't know what it was. Inflation was curtailed. COVID was defeated. The economy was in great shape. And she failed to distance herself from Biden, but why did she need to?
Well, she came out of the gate, I agree. She came out very strong. She barely put a foot wrong, in my view, right through the convention. Her approval rating spiked by something like 16 points in a couple of weeks. She came out, I thought, in a pretty strong position, and then I think the wheels began to come off. And ultimately, of course, there was that, to your point, there was that ill-fated appearance on ABC's The View, when she was asked the question that she knew was coming, everybody knew was coming, her advisors had prepared her for, and contrary to some other reporting that is out there, I know that Joe Biden personally called Kamala Harris and said, I get it. Don't worry about hurting my feelings. Do what you have to do, kid, in effect, not in so many words. She was unable to do it. She could not distance herself from Biden. When she was asked, what would you do differently? She said, I can't think of a single thing. That was a real turning point because, look, it was a change election. She had to be somehow the change candidate, even as she was the sitting vice president of the United States. Very tough, right?
She was joined with him at the hip. I mean, what could she have said in answer to that question that would have been a better answer?
I mentioned the example of Hubert Humphrey in '68. Imagine if she had said, suppose she had said, look, Joe Biden and I are proud of having done A, B, C, D, and E. But you know what? I'm here to tell you we blew it on inflation. And here's what I'm going to do about that now. And suppose she had hammered that relentlessly from that moment to the election. Who knows?
Well, she did.
Who knows?
She did make statements about inflation. I mean, Humphrey had a definite breaking point because Nixon really had no recipe for ending the war. Johnson had gotten us into the war. It certainly aggravated the war.
Yeah.
And everyone wanted to end it. And Humphrey was able to say, I'm going to end the war. That's what's different. What could she have said that would have been
again,
different?
I think she had to break with, she had to be the change candidate. And it's clear that the two issues that were decisive were the economy and the border. In my view, she couldn't really have credibly presented herself as tough on the border in any way where she could compete with Trump on that issue, fairly or not, because as we all know, Trump sank the toughest border security bill that has ever been put before Congress, and he did it cynically, and he was less interested in fixing the border than using it as a cudgel. Having said all that, she really needed, I think, to tackle the issue of inflation, and she just wasn't able to do it.
Well, of course, the issue of immigration, she was unfairly branded as the border czar, which she wasn't.
Right.
She did have the excellent point that he'd killed an immigration bill that Biden had sponsored.
But she made the point occasionally, but not very effectively.
Well, it seemed that after the debate, she tended to fizzle. I mean, there was nothing to her campaign. And do you think, Manafort, another one of your sources, a surprising source for you, said she was a flawed candidate from the beginning. Well, now, was that because she was a woman and she was black, or was it something else?
Well, talk about you mentioned Manafort, talk about a rogues gallery of characters. You think of Manafort, Corey Lewandowski, some of the other people who were in that campaign, below Susie Wiles and the co-chair, Chris LaZavita. They ran a very effective campaign, but I was able to connect with Manafort, and he was giving me regular briefings on what the president was telling him, what he was telling the president. He was operating under the radar. So that was a fascinating kind of insight, and you won't read in any other books. But having said that, Susie Wiles was also a great source for me, and she said, in brutally candid terms, she said, about Kamala Harris, we couldn't believe how bad she was. Now, you can chalk that up to, is that just Susie Wiles trolling Kamala Harris after the fact? Maybe. But it sounded awfully convincing that they never doubted for a moment that they would win that race. Wiles felt fairly or unfairly that Harris was just inauthentic. Say what you will, love him or hate him, Donald Trump is authentic. That was a big advantage. There were a lot of other
He had
factors.
more negatives than any other candidate in presidential history, because add to all the negatives of the first time around, he had January 6th, he had the indictments, he had 34 felony convictions. A jury came back and said he was guilty of sexual abuse. There was the $300 million fraud judgment against him in New York. What presidential candidate has ever
He wore all of that like a badge of honor, as you know.
A badge of honor, and he was the Teflon Don.
Yeah. I mean, they used to say that about Ronald Reagan back in the day, but boy, that was amateur hour compared to the way Trump became impervious to that kind of thing. And of course, let's not forget the assassination attempt in Butler, Pennsylvania, when he rose off of that stage with blood on his cheek and raised his fist and mouthed, "Fight, fight, fight." And think of the devastating split screen between him and Biden at that moment, with Biden climbing off of Air Force One, grasping the handrail and looking lost. You couldn't have scripted anything, a more devastating split screen. But Trump carried that into the convention, which became a coronation more than a convention. He was thought to have been spared by God to be president by many. It was pretty extraordinary.
Certainly the attempted assassination didn't hurt him, but
it was rocket fuel. It really.
What
was.
about their ability to paint Kamala as woke, as the candidate of the extreme left?
Yeah.
There was that marvelous ad, $40 million, 30,000 repetitions of the slogan, Kamala Harris is for they, them, President Trump is for you.
It's for you, yeah. That infamous ad about taxpayer-funded trans surgery, which became so effective. And you mentioned the tagline, which was very clever, but even more effective was the fact that it was Kamala Harris, in her own words, on videotape, saying that I advocated for this. But her failure to answer that ad, which, as you point out, everybody was watching on every football game across the country, reminded a lot of other Democratic operatives of the really devastating commercial against John Kerry, the Swiftboat Veterans for Truth, back in 2004, when Kerry, whose strong suit was supposedly his military service, was attacked relentlessly as a guy who was a traitor, was not a hero at all. That ad, Kerry failed to answer because the campaign was broke at that point. But the Harris campaign had plenty of money. They just couldn't figure out how to answer it, and they decided not to answer it.
Was there an answer?
Well, they tested 5 or 6 different answers in front of focus groups, which in my opinion is sometimes a waste of time. You can become trapped in these bubbles of algorithms and focus groups and all the rest. Common sense should have told them that they needed to answer that. A certain former presidential campaign manager for the Democrats, who shall remain nameless, a winning presidential campaign manager, said that he called up David Plouffe, the advisor on the Harris campaign, and said, "What are you doing? You gotta answer this thing." And the response essentially was, "There's no answer."
Well, but there is an answer, right? I mean, Donald Trump's for you. He wasn't for those he stiffed in Atlantic City. He wasn't for E. Jean Harris. He wasn't for democracy on January 6th or the Constitution or the rule of law. I mean, there were lots of answers to...
yeah, imagine if you had a rogues gallery of billionaires and said that Donald Trump is for they, them.
Yeah.
Kamala Harris is for you.
Yeah, even better.
You know, maybe you and I should be writing these ads.
Well, maybe they'll hire us. So the other big mistake that you have in the book, and the book is a great, great read. The other mistake was her dancing around about appearing on Joe Rogan's podcast.
Yeah.
And, and she handles herself well. She handled herself well in the debate as a former prosecutor.
Yeah.
And why she didn't want to go on, particularly toward the end, time was running out. It was time for that Hail Mary pass.
Yeah.
What did she have to lose?
Well, I think she reverted to her default mode, which is not to take risks. Having covered the first Biden White House, I wrote a book called The Fight of His Life, as you know, about the first 2 years. And she was always just overly cautious, afraid reluctant to make mistakes. And in this case, with Rogan, there were a couple of different factors. Part of it was some internal opposition from progressives who thought Rogan was beyond the pale. But once I got past that, it was a scheduling thing where they basically said they would do it if Rogan came to them, and Rogan wouldn't. And it ended up being a standoff. But it was, clearly a missed opportunity for her.
Well, of course, one of the dates that she was interested in Texas was a date Rogan said he had reserved for personal reasons. And who was on his show that day?
Trump.
Donald Trump.
Yeah.
For 3 hours.
Yeah.
So it may have been Rogan who didn't want her on.
It may well have been.
And, 15 million viewers or listeners, whatever you do to a podcast.
Yeah.
So all roads here seem to lead to Joe Biden. And the suggestion of the Tapper book, which you don't quite make, is there was some sort of elaborate cover-up going on, and that all of his close aides and family knew that he was failing, knew that he couldn't discharge the duties of the office, but they kept him in anyway, including Ron Klain, who was urging him to stay in even after the debate.
Look, I have a lot of respect for Tapper and Alex Thompson. I don't know Jake, I know Thompson. But that's just flat out wrong. The notion that this was a classic cover-up where everybody knew that Joe Biden was non-compos mentis and decided to hide him is just not right. The mystery at the heart of my book is the stunning extent to which Biden's inner circle became lost in this fog of delusion and denial. They were convinced, many of them, that Joe Biden could win the nomination and the election, and that he was perfectly capable of governing. I think they were delusional. I think that anybody, 77% of the American people, according to one poll, thought Biden was too old to run for re-election. They were right. They believed what they wanted to believe instead of their own lying eyes, in effect, even during that debate. Anita Dunn, a senior advisor, was watching a so-called dial group, a focus group of independent voters who turned dials down to react or up or down in real time. And the dials, of course, were on the floor when Biden was losing it. But later on, because the dials turned down on Trump when he was saying outrageous things, Anita Dunn convinced herself that Biden had somehow won the debate. It was crazy. It was delusional. Ron Klain, who tells me in the book, in his words, not mine, just how out of it Joe Biden was during the Camp David debate prep before the debate, not able to follow the back and forth of the campaign, unable to talk about what he wanted to do in a second term, wandering off to the pool, falling sound asleep in a lounge chair. Ron Klain, of all people, a very savvy White House chief of staff prior to this, before he did the debate prep, convinced himself that Biden was the guy. He was fighting a 11th hour battle against his successor, Jeff Zients, the White House chief, trying to keep Biden at the top of the ticket, even after Zients was convinced it was time to go. He said to Zients, Jeff, this is an avoidable tragedy. Again, I think Klain was delusional, but it's much stranger and more compelling and more human, more tragic, I think the story is, than a classic cover-up.
Deliberate cover-up, perhaps no, but they deluded themselves and were thinking he could go the distance.
They deluded themselves. There's no question about it. My only point here is that, contrary to some other reporting that's out there, Joe Biden was no Woodrow Wilson. He was not this guy who was non compos mentis while some cabal ran the government. That's complete nonsense. And there are way too many inconvenient facts for that theory. Moments when Biden was, when senators came to see him returning from Israel and were treated to a master class on the Middle East where he knew every nuance and every detail. The morning that he abdicated, he was parsing the details of a multi-nation prisoner swap. You can't just wish these things away. You have to somehow account for the fact that that's the same guy who lost it in the debate. It's more complicated, I think, as a story.
But also a guy who couldn't recognize two members of his cabinet, couldn't remember their names, couldn't recognize George Clooney, one of his principal donors, and who seemed to be completely out of it in the debate preparation, didn't understand.
Yeah, so I'm not arguing by any means that any of this was benign either. I mean, I think this was a political scandal of historic dimensions. I think it was an abdication of leadership, starting with Biden's inner circle and extending through the entire Democratic Party. They were all cowed, and nobody had the courage, nobody had the blanking you-know-what, as Bill Daley put it, to step up and challenge him, with the exception of Dean Phillips, essentially. And it had enormous consequences. It turns into a tragedy for Joe Biden, the Democratic Party, and arguably the nation, because Biden had this tragic flaw at the end of the day. A guy who could have been a consequential president, who was in many ways consequential, ends up with a story that results in tragedy.
And the further tragedy we know about now, that he's battling for his life against cancer.
Yeah.
So anyway, I have a question for you, Chris. Sure. Whipple. And the question is there any way that Kamala Harris could have won the 2024 election?
Yeah, I'm not one of those who argues that it was mission impossible. There are people I respect who believe that the tide of anti-incumbent sentiment around the world was so irresistible that she had no chance. Something like 50 out of 64 incumbents since COVID struck in 2020 had been swept out of office. She was swimming against a fearsome tide, without any doubt about it. But this was not a landslide, despite Trump's claims to the contrary. This was 1.5 percentage points, essentially 7 states. And I can't help but think that it was winnable. But it's hard to put my finger on any single thing that could have made the difference. But I think the overwhelming thing was that she was unable to present herself as a change candidate.
Unable to present herself as a change candidate. Well, Chris Whipple, this has been marvelous. Thank you for coming by. Thank you for coming by. Tune in next week for more conversations. And please get our app on your iPhone so you can hear our shows while you're on the run.